Hey guys, today we'll be discussing Theodore Roosevelt's thoughts on socialism and anarchism. I think it is a really interesting subject that I'm not sure has been covered in much explicit depth yet on YouTube. If you're new to the channel, in my style of videos, I like to incorporate a lot of direct quotes so you can hear what people thought in their own words. I will, of course, provide context, analysis, and interpretation when necessary, though. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. Okay. I think it would be most useful to begin by considering what Theodore Roosevelt meant by the terms anarchist and socialist, or rather, what he did not mean by them. Namely, I mean to say that Roosevelt is not usually referring to Karl Marx or Marxist orthodoxy when he speaks of socialists and anarchists. I'm unsure what background information you, the viewer, are bringing in about the intricacies of left-wing political theory. I certainly don't blame you if it's not much. So I thought I would just point out at the beginning here that Theodore Roosevelt will not really directly or indirectly remark on Marxists for 90% of the video. Instead, Roosevelt more has in mind these types of people if you're interested. As a final note on Marxism, Roosevelt thought it was unserious and fanatical. In his autobiography, he said, "Too many thoroughly well-meaning men and women in the America of today glibly repeat and accept, much as medieval schoolmen repeated and accepted authorized dogma in their day, various assumptions and speculations by Marx and others, which by the lapse of time and by actual experiment have been shown to possess not one shred of value." He went on to say in the same passage that the socialists of his country and day were actually just radical social reformers, and not even necessarily connected to the specific Marxist project. Anyways, so now that we got some of that technical stuff out of the way, we can now move on to the topic of this video proper. I think we'll start with anarchism. Really, the key to understanding Theodore Roosevelt's thoughts on the matter is to consider how he became president in the first place. Remember, Roosevelt was originally Vice President William McKinley for about 6 months until McKinley was assassinated. And who was responsible for killing McKinley? That would be a man named Leon Czolgosz. And what was he? Well, he was an anarchist. Theodore Roosevelt was fully enraged by the event, and it was an anger well beyond just being upset about the attack against McKinley, the man. Roosevelt saw the crime as an attack against America itself and the principles of government. The fear was that radical and subversive ideas were being imported from Europe to the detriment of the United States. Such sentiments inspired the language of President Roosevelt's first annual message to Congress, which began with a 2,000-word impassioned rant against the evils of anarchism. I'll read to you some extracts from that address. President McKinley was killed by an utterly depraved criminal, belonging to that body of criminals who object to all governments, good and bad alike, who are against any form of popular liberty if it is guaranteed by even the most just and liberal laws, and who are hostile to the upright exponent of free people's sober will as to the tyrannical and irresponsible despot. The anarchist, and especially the anarchist in the United States, is merely one type of criminal, more dangerous than any other, because he represents the same depravity in a greater degree. The anarchist is a criminal whose perverted instincts lead him to prefer confusion and chaos to the most beneficent form of social order. The anarchist is everywhere not merely the enemy of system and of progress, but the deadly foe of liberty. If ever anarchy is triumphant, its triumph will last but for one red moment, to be succeeded for ages by the gloomy night of despotism. The cause of his criminality is to be found in his own evil passions, and in the evil conduct of those who urge him on, not in any failure by others, or by the state to do justice to him or his. He is a malefactor and nothing else. He is in no sense, in no shape or way, a product of social conditions, save as a highwayman is produced by the fact that an unarmed man happens to have a purse. Anarchy is a crime against the whole human race, and all mankind should band against the anarchist. His crime should be made an offense against the law of nations, like piracy and that form of man-stealing known as the slave trade, for it is a far blacker infamy than either. Roosevelt would go on to suggest that the Congress should, in the wake of McKinley's assassination and the earlier Haymarket affair, enact legislation to deport all anarchist immigrants from the country. And this would actually later manifest in the Immigration Act of 1903. But what is the broader takeaway here? Well, clearly Roosevelt did not like anarchists. It seems that Roosevelt believed anarchism always implied or concluded with violence. Anarchists, for him, are to be understood as genuinely terrible people who, as vague discontents or lovers of destruction, hide behind a miserable ideology so as to pretend to have justification and structure to their beliefs. Alright, I think it's time to move on to Roosevelt's thoughts on socialism, which are much more complex and nuanced. Roosevelt himself was not infrequently accused of being a socialist. That was never true, of course, but Roosevelt would kind of occupy a strange place under the modern political paradigm. For the purposes of illustration, he may be described in modern vocabulary as economically liberal and socially conservative. Roosevelt saw himself as a moderate, middle ground figure, a balancing force against the rapacious, Gilded Age capitalists on the one hand and the spiteful, myopic socialists on the other. There is a really interesting passage in Edmund Morris' third volume of his Theodore Roosevelt biography that incisively captures Roosevelt's mindset better than I could hope to, so I'll just read that out to you. His radicalism was a matter of energy rather than urgency. It wanted to spread out and embrace social, not socialistic, reformers, labor leaders who spoke decent English, church-going farmers, businessmen with a strong sense of community responsibility, and even the occasional polite, self-made Negro, such as Booker T. Washington. A strong sense of fairness saved him from complacency. If he was less motivated by compassion than anger at what he saw as the arrogance of capital, he chafed nonetheless to regulate it. Roosevelt strongly believed in the need for reform, just not the socialist kind in either method or scope. To that end, before he officially broke with the Republican Party in 1912, Roosevelt desperately tried to pull the party forward into the new century. He was worried that the Republicans were in serious danger of becoming out of touch with the times and sentiments of the country, which left those who wanted change to follow the last option available to them: socialism. But what was Roosevelt's problem with socialism anyway? The short answer is that he thought socialism and socialists were naive, hyper-pessimistic doomers with zero tact or pragmatism. Theodore Roosevelt thought that socialist writings produced an unhealthy effect on political discourse. He disliked the socialist Upton Sinclair's The Jungle for that reason, writing about it and other books critical of capitalism that, while they set forth many facts which are true, they convey an entirely false impression when they imply that these are the only facts that are true and that the whole life is such as they represented. And, what is more, it produces the very feeling which makes men feel that there is no use of trying to reform anything, because everything is so rotten that the whole social structure should either be let alone or destroyed. Essentially, Roosevelt thought that socialists tended to speak only in one-sided black pills, which was pretty unconstructive, but more critically, it was incredibly dangerous. Implicit in the demand for revolution is the charge that the system of the United States is a failure and is too weak to handle the fundamental issues. Theodore Roosevelt was certainly no originalist, but he believed in the Constitution, and he was not ready to throw it away in favor of some new and probably worse governing structure that a bunch of impetuous radicals came up with. One of Roosevelt's most explicit exhortations on socialism comes from a letter he wrote in reply to a journalist who accused him of being a man of limited vision, who fights against specific evils, but shies away from fighting the fundamental evil. Roosevelt was obviously triggered by this and said in his defense that, "I am fighting evil in the mass, in the only way in which it is possible to fight it, when I fight different evils in the concrete. When you speak of the system, you use a word that has a certain convenience and that appeals more or less to the imagination. But when you begin practically to speak of fighting the system, as if it meant anything else than doing a man's duty according to the old standards, you simply lapse back into the condition of those religious enthusiasts of the days of Cromwell, who announced that it was useless to try to improve humanity unless by a radical change." This kind of talk did not indicate advanced morality nearly as much as it indicated an unsound mind, and the same statement applies exactly to those who use large phrases to cover up other vagueness of thought when they come to deal with the political and social evils of today. The men who have done good in the 25 years I've been in politics are those who have had ideals, but who have tried to realize them in plain, practical fashion, and who have tried to do each his duty as the day came, and to fight each evil as they found it arise, without bothering their heads as to the ultimate evil. I believe in the man who takes the next step, not those who theorize about the 200th step. Again, my experience has been that mighty little good comes from the individual who is fighting the system in the abstract, just as mighty little good comes from the church member who is fighting Beelzebub in the abstract. I care nothing either for the reformer or the church member who does not try to do good in the concrete. and who is not ashamed to cover his deficiencies in particular concrete cases by vague mouthings about general abstract principles, which are as nebulous in his mind as in the minds of others. Absolutely brutal. Okay. Roosevelt's position here is that the only way to actually get things done 99% of the time is through reform in the system, and not revolutionary upheaval. He has no problems with idealists who are able to set down their dreamy models for a moment to achieve some tangible action when needed. However, Roosevelt is not super impressed with the type of idealist, in this case the socialist, who just kind of stands there on the side complaining and who doesn't help remedy the ills of society because they refuse to do anything but fight the ultimate cause of evil, which can only be done through their ideology, where everything is ostensibly perfect on paper. The brand of person presumptuous enough to lecture others about a morality that they do not possess and a set of ideas they do not understand. In any case, let's close out this video by discussing a set of editorial pieces Theodore Roosevelt authored in 1909. They are titled, Where We Cannot Work with Socialists, and Where We Can Work with Socialists. We'll talk about where we cannot work with socialists first, and somewhat briefly, because I think you get the idea by now. So in this piece, Roosevelt returns to his moderation themes by situating himself and history against two diametric extremes, absolute individualism and absolute socialism. Both are equally detrimental to civilization, but Roosevelt said that as socialism was the one growing in popularity, he felt compelled to focus on it more. And so he writes, The doctrinaire socialists, the extremists, the men who represent the doctrine in its most advanced form, are, and must necessarily be, not only convinced opponents of private property, but also bitterly hostile to religion and morality. In short, they must be opposed to all those principles through which, and through which alone, even an imperfect civilization can be built up by slow advances through the ages. Right. So Roosevelt believed that private property and an organized system of morality, historically done through religion, are necessary to the foundation and growth of a civil society. He was also disgusted by the socialist desire for the destruction of the traditional family and of marriage. All of these are fine and fair critiques. However, Roosevelt does take it to a weird place and shoot himself in the foot posterity-wise. Advanced socialist leaders are fond of declaiming against patriotism, of announcing their movement as international, and of claiming to treat all men alike. But on this point, as on all others, their system would not stand for one moment the test of actual experiment. If the leaders of the Socialist Party in America should today endeavor to force their followers to admit all Negroes and Chinamen to real equality, their party would promptly disband. Well, you can't win them all. I could, of course, point out to you that this was written over 100 years ago and all that, but you already know that or you don't care, so. Moving on, Roosevelt concludes with some criticisms on the villainization of wealth. Of course, wealth is no more criminal than labor. Human society cannot exist without both. And if all wealth were abolished this week, the majority of laborers would starve next week. It is really difficult to show patience when asked to discuss such a proposition as that all wealth is produced solely by the work of manual workers, and that the entire product should be handed over to them. A great industry can no more be managed by a mass meeting of manual laborers than a battle could be won in such fashion. Then a painters' union could paint a Rembrandt, or a typographical union write one of Shakespeare's plays. Roosevelt goes into more depth and discusses other things, but I presented a lot of the main substance. I would really recommend you read it for yourself if you had the time or inclination. Now, that leaves us with the grand finale, the sister piece, Where We Can Work with Socialists. I know what you're thinking. Wow, didn't Teddy just trash talk these guys for the entirety of the video? He did, and this editorial's title is a little deceiving. It is not really about working with socialists, but rather working around them. Whatever the case, Roosevelt closes the loop on many of the video's themes here. It opens with, there is an amount of evil in our social and industrial conditions of today, and unless we recognize this fact and try resolutely to do what we can to remedy the evil, we run great risk of seeing men in their misery turn to the false teachers whose doctrines would indeed lead them to greater misery, but who do at least recognize the fact that they are now miserable. That is to say, that there were legitimate problems with working conditions, malevolent trusts, and the balance between capital and labor. To wholesale ignore the most glaring issues and not proffer any solutions would be to indirectly strengthen the cause of socialism. Roosevelt continues, There are many peculiarly high-minded men and women who like to speak of themselves as socialists, whose attitude, conscious or unconscious, is really merely an indignant recognition of the evil of present conditions and an ardent wish to remedy it, and whose socialism is really only an advanced form of liberalism. Not all types of socialist are bad or unconscionable. There are good people who have merely been led astray, and others who are not as out there as they think they are. Developing that idea, Roosevelt urges the reader to avoid uncritically dismissing ideas and programs just because they are labeled as socialist. No, he says, regulating the railways is not socialist. Neither is a robust state education program or a national sewage system. They may or may not be the best approach, which means it is our responsibility to acknowledge and debate them. Roosevelt may think the concept of wage slavery is ridiculous, but he does conclude that we recognize and are bound to war against the evils of today. The remedies are partly economic and partly spiritual, partly to be obtained by laws, and in greater part to be obtained by individual and associated effort. For character is the vital matter, and character cannot be created by law. These remedies include a religious and moral teaching which shall increase the spirit of human brotherhood, an education system which shall train men for every form of useful service, and which shall train us to prize common sense no less than morality, such a division of the profits of industry as shall tend to encourage intelligent and thrifty tool users to become tool owners, and a government so strong, just, wise, and democratic that, neither lagging too far behind, nor pushing heedlessly in advance, it may do its full share in promoting these ends. Overall, Roosevelt is asserting that there were some reforms needed in capitalism. Not of the socialistic variety, though. Furthermore, he is saying that economics represented but one dimension of the evils of his day. There was also moral and character goals that needed to be negotiated as well, and the socialist prescription was very much the wrong one. And that was Theodore Roosevelt's thoughts on socialism. Habitual presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs actually wrote a response to Roosevelt's two editorials. And I'm not trying to poison the well here or anything, but I read through it and it's really not that good. I'm letting you know it exists though, so if you want to form your own opinion on it, you are obviously more than welcome to do so. Well anyways, thanks for watching the video. This video is definitely not the final word on the subject. I think I may do a series on Theodore Roosevelt's ideology through his most famous speeches someday, which includes more of his thoughts on individualism, for instance. So, if you like this content, you can show your support by hitting the subscribe button and leaving a comment. Alright, thank you for watching. I hope you have a good one.